North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and we're located in Carolina Beach and serving right now the Wilmington area and the local beach communities. And I invite you to learn more about our chapter and our upcoming events on our Facebook page, which is the little @ Island Wildlife CB, or by emailing us at islandwildlifenc@gmail.com. And I'll tell you a little bit about those upcoming events after Lindsay's talk. And our guest this evening is the wonderful Lindsay Addison. Lindsay works as the coastal biologist for Audubon, North Carolina, and in her role, she manages, monitors, and protects coastal birds in North Carolina and beyond. She and her team are also responsible for protecting the nesting sites for over 1/3 of the coastal waterbirds in North Carolina. If you spend time on the lower Cape Fear River, you've likely seen Lindsay on the water as she makes her rounds among the spoil islands, at least 2 of which, I think that's right, are designated as nationally recognized Audubon IBAs, or important bird areas. She also sometimes, when we're not in a pandemic, has need of volunteers, so perhaps she can tell us a little bit more about how to get involved with those efforts and with your local Audubon chapters. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Virginia, and thanks to all of you for having me and for coming out. I'm going to share my screen here, and we're gonna take a little tour on the Cape Fear River and talk about the waterbirds that nest there. I like to give a little bit of background on Audubon as an organization every time I give a talk, especially to a new group. And the reason the Audubon Society exists is because of the feathers that you see coming out of this bird's rear end. Those are called plumes or egrets, and egrets and herons grow these filamentous feathers during the breeding season in order to attract a mate. But unfortunately, they also attracted the unwanted attention of high fashion in the late 1800s and early 1900s, using birds, sometimes taxidermied birds, sometimes only the feathers of the birds, to adorn ladies' hats was all the rage. And at one point, feathers were worth more per ounce than gold. Another affliction of these birds was market hunting. And while today hunting is well regulated and managed so that populations of wildlife are not harmed by these activities, back in the day, people went out and hunted wild animals at a commercial scale for to sell on the commercial market. And one of the methods that they would use to do this was to go out in this what's called a punt boat, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And they would basically use a really large rifle, or a shotgun, I should say, in order to shoot up the colonies where these birds would aggregate, because they nest in groups. And because their eggs and their chicks were at the colonies, they tend to come back and stay in that same place. So it's easier to hunt them and get a whole lot of them at once. And they would be shot for their meat, and they would be shot for the fashion industry. And this activity caused a lot of consternation as people around the country noticed that their populations were in decline. And what resulted in that was the formation of the first Audubon societies back in the 1880s. And what these groups did was primarily 2 things. First, they hired wardens, which were people whose job was to protect these areas. And in order to be able to protect the areas, they would have to get some kind of authority. So they might work with the state or purchase these places in order to keep them safe. And keep in mind, this was well before there were any state wildlife agencies to regulate and protect our natural resources. The person you see in the photograph on the left is a warden at the first National Wildlife Refuge, Pelican Island down in Florida. His name was Paul Krogel, and that's a pelican chick that he's sitting with. The other thing that the Audubon societies did was they did advocacy. So they pushed their the federal government and their state governments to pass laws protecting wildlife. And again, this was over 100 years ago. This was kind of a new concept. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which has gotten a lot of press in the past few years, both because it celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2017 and because it was under threat from the previous administration recently, was enacted due to the Audubon Society's advocacy efforts to basically protect migratory birds, and that law still stands today and is one of the most important tools we have for protecting our birds. So out of this history is what the Audubon Society came from. We do not have unregulated hunting, and nobody really wears bird feathers on their hats anymore, but they do still need protection from a variety of different threats, one of those being disturbance, particularly at nesting areas, but also during wintering and migration when they need to conserve their energy in order to make flights of thousands of miles. They need to raise their young, or they need to be able just to survive a cold night. And as you disturb a bird, it might be scared away from its eggs or its chicks, which are exposed to temperature stress or to predators like a gull or a crow that might swoop in. And also at nesting colonies, if you have too much human disturbance, they will just abandon it after a while and try to find a different location. Another challenge birds face is de facto habitat loss, where you have good habitat, but there are incompatible uses. And Virginia, I have to say, I've used this photo just because it's a photo that I have, but it is the north end of Carolina Beach, which is Freeman Park. And Freeman Park is actually a great example of this is a really good place for people to go, and they get to use Freeman Park, and they get to have this type of activity and recreation available to them there. But just on the other side of the inlet is Masonboro Island, and there human habitat use is very managed differently, and that gives the birds a place to be as well. So I like to think that it's kind of a good balance between really heavy human use and beach driving on Carolina Beach and places for birds adjacent on Masonboro Island. Another challenge that birds and indeed all wildlife face on the coast is just development that either degrades or destroys coastal habitats. One example are inlets. Birds rely on natural inlets with a lot of sandbars and shoals where invertebrates burrow into the sand. They need that as foraging areas. And when we disturb inlets too much, we try to keep them in one place and dredge them, that those elements of habitat are lost. And this can be a problem for birds. Another huge challenge birds on the coast, especially nesting birds, face is superabundant human commensal predators. And that just means animals like raccoons, foxes, coyotes, cats that live in association and have adapted well to being around people. In fact, cats, of course, are a domestic species, so they're here because of us. And those animals, when we subsidize them with extra food, with garbage that we don't contain well, are able to have a much higher population than they would otherwise, and can be really devastating predators on eggs and chicks. And just for kind of perspective, wild birds are adapted to survive all kinds of conditions that nature throws at them. This is a least tern incubating his or her nest during a tropical storm. And yet there are some things that they really can't withstand, and that's wholesale destruction of their habitat, loss of habitat due to incompatible recreation, things like that. And this is a dredge operating at Masonboro Inlet, and it was actually dredged away the sand that these black skimmers, the birds in the photo, were trying to nest on. And so they can take a lot, but there are some things that they just need us to help them out with. And that's kind of where Audubon comes in today. Birds still face problems. They still need people to do conservation. And so Audubon, North Carolina is the state office of the National Audubon Society. We have one full-time staff person here on the coast and 2 seasonal folks in most years. We won't get into the pandemic. And we have a little under 20 islands, and on those islands are over 40,000 nesting birds. And between about 1/3 and 40% of North Carolina's coastal nesting waterbirds are on the sanctuaries that we manage and protect. And just so you know, we don't make these numbers up or or make a wild guess. we actually count them every 3 years. There's a coast-wide count of all the nesting coastal waterbirds, and this is a picture of one of our people counting nests on white ibis nests on Battery Island there on the top picture, and on the lower picture is a royal tern colony up near Ocracoke. And these surveys have been going on for over 40 years, and they're really done to detect trends in population, distribution, habitat use along North Carolina's coast. And so the last complete census was in 2017. There was a census in 2020, but some species could not be counted entirely due to pandemic restrictions. But as you can see in 2017, this was the way the numbers added up. So hopefully I've convinced you that I'm not just telling you a big fib or making a wild guess. So anyway, on our sanctuaries, we do management, monitoring, and research. And management is just basically anything that you would do in order to make conditions better for your target species, plants or animals, at a site. The upper left-hand picture shows a couple of volunteers stringing up a posting, which is basically wooden 2x2 posts with signs on them and twine strung between them. This is an indication to people that this is a bird nesting area. It keeps the people out of the nesting areas, lets the birds rest in peace and nest in peace, as we like to say, and the people can still enjoy the beach. One of the things about management is you don't really know what to do if you're not getting feedback. So you want to do some monitoring in order to determine how your target species are doing. And so that can include doing international shorebird survey counts, which is what the person on the right-hand side of the picture is doing. This helps us to track local populations and larger scale population trends in our shorebirds, many of which are non-breeding in the state of North Carolina, but are here in the shoulder months or over the winter. When they're not here, they're up in the Arctic nesting on the tundra. We also track productivity, so how many chicks and fledglings our birds produce at our sites, that type of thing. And finally, we do research, which is to answer a particular question that we might have. The oyster catcher, the brightly beaked bird in the lower left-hand corner, is getting a data logger put on it that's going to track its movements very, very closely. It's going to send a signal to the GPS satellite system every 15 minutes and tell us where the bird is, if we can catch it and get the little electronic device back off its back. And the goal of all of this is to preserve sites that are important for waterbirds on the coast of North Carolina so that they have healthy, stable populations, and also to provide a venue for students and other researchers to come and add to what we know about these species. I'm going to focus now, when Virginia asked me to give this talk, we kind of zeroed in on the Cape Fear River because it's basically adjacent to Carolina Beach, which is where her chapter is. And the Cape Fear River is a really large estuary in the southern part of the state. Most of you are probably familiar with it, but just kind of to orient you, the landmass that kind of terminates down by the legend, that's Bald Head Island. Southport and Brunswick County is the landmass on the left-hand or the west side of the pit photo, and then the right-hand side is just kind of the southern end of Carolina Beach, Curry Beach, way up at the top, going down to Fort Fisher, and so on. And these islands that are pointed out in the little colored dots are the bird nesting islands that we work at on the lower Cape Fear River. We have a memorandum of understanding with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, which is the landowner, and we have been the managing organization there for getting on close to 40 years. So now, birds can go anywhere, they can fly, right? They have wings, but so why are they all wanting to go to islands? And the main reason birds want to nest on islands is because it provides them with three critical things that they need. First of all, if you're a coastal nesting bird, like a tern or a skimmer or even a pelican, you're probably nesting on or near the ground. You're not up in a tree like a cardinal. And so you are really sensitive to predation by mammals, and you do not want something like a raccoon or a coyote or a fox or a cat anywhere near you. And the islands that they nest on tend to be rather small on the river. They don't support their own populations of mammals. They don't have enough resources year round. So the birds are relatively safe from those really devastating predators. There can be problems with crows and gulls, but at least they don't have to worry about this raccoon. And it is really hard to find a picture of a raccoon that does not look cute. This was one of the only ones I could find. The other thing that these birds need is they need to have good elevation. So they nest on islands, they nest on the coast, but they don't want to be flooded. Now, I don't have a picture of a flooded island because that just looks like water, but this is a picture of some of the flooding on the Mississippi River from the early 90s. And that concept is just, they need to have some habitat that is elevated enough above the storm tide that they can make a living there. And finally, they need to have the right habitat on that island. For some birds, that's going to mean a sandy substrate, like this egg that you see here in the middle. That's an oyster catcher nest, and they tend to want to put their eggs on the sand. Other birds that like to nest in open sandy substrates include terns and skimmers. And if you're a pelican or an egret, you might be looking for some low shrubs or even some trees. So the islands on the river have a variety of different habitats that are suitable for different groups of species. Now, we have two different types of islands on the river. First of all, we've got natural islands, which this is Shellbed Island. The text in the bottom corner is wrong, so I'm sorry for that. It's not South Pelican Island. It is Shellbed Island, and it's a large, natural, marshy island. And what you're looking at here in this white is not sand, but oyster shell, and that's called a shell rake. So oyster reefs near to the island produce a lot of shells. When the oysters die and the shells become loose from the reef, they get washed up in kind of these windrows along the island, and these are elevated usually above high tide, and they provide really great nesting habitat for birds like oyster catchers and laughing gulls and willets. We also have on the Cape Fear River dredged material islands, and these are not natural islands. They were created by people. When the navigation channel of the Cape Fear River is dredged, they need a place to put the sand, and often they'll want to put it close to the channel so they don't have to spend a lot of money hauling it around. And these dredged material islands were created in the late 60s, early 70s. And what they didn't realize at the time was that birds would like them. They were not designed to be habitat for birds, but when you have a bunch of sand and you put it in a big pile, and it's a nice little island, 6 or 8 acres, you're going to attract a lot of birds. And in fact, you can see this is South Pelican Island, and it is one of the largest royal tern colonies in the state. That cloud of birds, or I should say the cloud of white, the blobby white stuff up above the island in the air is a cloud of royal terns. There's probably about 3,000, over 3,000 birds in that picture. And I think a bald eagle flew by and scared them. So that's why they're all up in the air. So over the years, these dredged material islands have become really important for nesting birds in the state. And I'm going to take you through some of the species that are found on the Cape Fear River, just kind of give you a quick introduction to them. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the brown pelican. Everybody knows the brown pelican. And the numbers of pairs are from the 2017 census. I didn't update it with the 2020 numbers because I couldn't do that for every species. So I just stuck with that. But on the Cape Fear River, there's usually about 25% of the state's nesting brown pelicans. And they do like to nest on these kind of grassy habitats. They do build a nest, and the male and the female, but primarily the male, he'll bring in sticks and shrubbery, and they will basically weave it into a large platform over a foot across, and they'll lay 2 to 3 eggs in that nest. They'll both incubate, the male and the female, and when the chick hatches, it looks like a small dinosaur, basically. They're what we call altricial, so just like a baby bluebird, when they hatch out, they're pretty helpless. Their eyes are shut. They don't have any feathers. They need to be constantly cared for by a parent. And it's really quite remarkable that these big, clumsy-looking pelicans can be really quite agile and gentle with their chicks. So that's a pretty cool thing to get to see as they raise the chicks. The next species that we've got on the Cape Fear River, and one that is kind of mildly famous for, is the white ibis. And the island on the river that all the ibis tend to be on every year is called Battery Island. It's right opposite Southport, and it is one of the most important ibis nesting sites in the entire hemisphere. It's peaked out at about 14 or 15,000 pairs. In the most recent census in 2017, we weren't able to count it last year due to the pandemic, but in 2017 we counted 10,167 pairs on the river. And as you can see, the ibis is a really striking bird. When they're in their breeding plumage, they keep themselves really clean and white, and actually their bills and the fleshy part of their face gets bright red, and that's just happens right around courtship. So early in the springtime, late March into April, and they're attracting. Oh, and I should have said, we have on Battery Island up to about 80% of the state's nesting white ibis. And so, as I was saying, they get really attractive. They stand around and they court and they pick a nest site with their mate, and they look pretty fabulous. And then things kind of go downhill as they raise the chicks. You could see this bird here on the nest. It's in the incubation phase, and it's lost that really bright red color, and it's gone back to faded pink. Interestingly, when they hatch out after about 21 days of incubation, the chicks are not white. They're black. They've got they're fuzzy black down, and they have, as you can see, a really short bill. So all these birds that you see on the coast that have these long bills, when they hatch out, their bills are not fully grown at all. So they have to do quite a bit of growing before they can fledge and leave the nest. But they do, and this is what teenage ibis chicks look like. Still not white. They won't get white until their second year at the earliest. And one of the most amusing behaviors that we have among all the birds on the river is the ibis chicks' shakedown of their parents. So the parents are really good about they both the male and the female will feed the chicks, and they bring the food back to the colony in their bellies. So they regurgitate the food for the chicks. And as you can see, the regurgitation is stimulated by the chicks getting really excited, and they make kind of a raspy gargling noise, and they start pecking and grabbing the parent's bill. And then once the parent is ready to regurgitate, the chicks will actually stick their faces down their parents' throats because they're so excited to get this food. And it's more of a mugging than a feeding. And the parents, as the chicks get bigger, the parents become more and more cagey about actually wanting to come back and feed them. So these are quite put upon parents. And as you can see, they're just getting dingier and dingier over the season. So they started off bright white, and they get kind of frazzled by the end. And one of the reasons that they get tired out by the time the chicks are ready to leave the nest is they're going on these sometimes 40-mile one-way trips to find food for their chicks. Now, the chicks don't really want salty food when they're very small, because they're not very good at eliminating salt from their systems yet. They're too young for that. And so the parents will feed in inland, or I should say freshwater wetlands, or possibly on a golf course, in order to get food. Their favorite food to feed the chicks, and the food that the chicks grow the fastest and the best on, is actually crayfish or crawdads, or however you want to say it. And sometimes they'll go as far as Lake Waccamaw in order to get those tasty treats. But there is a lot of foraging in Brunswick County around Southport, St. James. So if you're from that part of our little slice of North Carolina, those ibis that you see in the summertime feeding in wetlands in Brunswick County are very likely doing so in order to feed their chicks over on Battery Island. We also have two species of terns that nest on the Cape Fear River in large numbers, and those are royal terns and sandwich terns. And as you can see, We have approaching 4,000 pairs of royal terns in a good year, and we can even top 1,000 pairs of sandwich terns. And together, that's about a third of the state's population of these species. As you can see in this photo, they nest in really dense colonies. Some birds, when they're nesting in their colonies, their nests are spaced out a little bit more, but these birds are really just within about a bill's peck length of each other. And they do not build a nest that like a pelican does or an ibis does. They just make a simple scrape in the sand. And that's pretty typical for terns and skimmers and some of the other birds. They don't all build a traditional nest out of sticks. So this is a royal tern, and they basically lay one egg. They are, unlike a lot of birds, they really kind of focus on getting everything right for this one chick. So they raise a whole bunch of only children. And their eggs are highly variable. That's the inset is a close-up of one of them. And they can range in color from being kind of brownish or tannish to even having a bit of a purple cast, which is the case with the egg in the photo. It just may not be very clear. Once the chicks hatch, they're quite fuzzy and cute, and they stay with the parents for about a week in the area of the nest scrape. And then they form what's called a creche. And so instead of each chick kind of being in its little depression of a nest, they all form a big chick herd, and they walk around the island like a bunch of little zebras on a miniature savanna. And the creche is tended to by the adults that have not gone out to the ocean to look for fish. So there's kind of a cooperative babysitting situation going on for about a month and a half until the chicks learn to fledge or learn to fly, which is called fledging. And so it's an interesting cooperative strategy. They incubate their own eggs, they feed their own chicks, they don't feed other terns' chicks, but they do protect the creche as a group of adults. And so they do have an element of cooperation there. We have a lot of egrets and herons. These are those elegant, long-legged, long-necked birds, really gorgeous. If you live on one of our creeks or near any form of water, be it fresh or salt, you're going to probably see one of these guys at some point. The species of herons and egrets that we have nesting on the river are the great egret, the snowy egret, the black-crowned night heron, the tricolored heron, the little blue heron, and the cattle egret. These happen to be great egrets. And all of those species together, we usually have a little over 1,000 pairs of them, and about 25% of the state's nesting egrets and herons are on the Cape Fear River. And the two of the birds that people sometimes get confused or ask, how can you tell the difference? We've got the great egret and the snowy egret. Now, there is a size difference, and it's a little more pronounced than these photos would suggest, but the great egret is much larger than the snowy egret. The great egret also has a yellow bill, and the snowy egret has a black bill. But the most important thing about the snowy egret is that it has yellow feet. And so if you can see those yellow feet, it's really easy to tell that you have a snowy egret. And you can remember the yellow feet and a snowy egret because of the old joke about not eating yellow snow. Another thing that is kind of special to snowy egrets is their plumes. They sometimes kind of have a little cowlick up that turns up at the end of them. And that's this picture of this egret kind of shows that off, but that's not necessarily diagnostic because the wind could flip up the feathers on a great egret and make it look like it has that little curly Q at the top as well. Egrets and herons are one of the birds that really need islands with some fairly established vegetation. They like to nest in trees or in shrubs. This is a little cedar thicket that they have colonized. And so they really are a species that needs these islands that have vegetation on them. So you can see that we go from a range of bare sand, nothing else, to trees, please, when it comes to nesting requirements. They do have the most lovely blue eggs. I've never been able to find out why. Nobody seems to know, but they are blue. This is a great egret nest. They lay 3 to 4 eggs. And that's pretty much consistent across all of the wading bird species. And they have the most ridiculous looking chicks. They too, like the pelicans, are altricial when they first hatch. They're very helpless, very uncoordinated. They don't have a lot going for them, but pretty soon they grow into these gangly teenagers. They spend a lot of time pecking each other, and eventually they'll fledge. And they do take quite a while to leave the nest. They have one of the longer chick rearing periods of the species. And last, one of my very favorite species is the American oyster catcher. There's about 100 pairs that nest on the Cape Fear River, and that makes about a quarter, again, of the state's nesting population. There's also large numbers on Masonboro Island, Lee-Hutaff Island, if you're familiar with some of the barrier island habitats in the Cape Fear region. American oyster catchers are unlike the other species that I've talked about in that they are not colonial, so they do not nest in groups. Each pair has its own territory, and they lay, again, we have a theme here, 2 to 3 eggs. That's a pretty safe guess. If you're talking about a larger species of bird, 2 to 3 eggs is pretty normal clutch size. And their chicks, unlike most of these other birds' chicks that we were looking at, are what is called precocial. These chicks, the oldest, that the 2 chicks here, the one in the foreground is the oldest. It might be a day old, and the one in the background is still drying off a little bit, so it just hatched that morning. And they're able to get up and walk around from the get-go. And they do, though, take about a full month to learn to fly. And then the other thing, though, is that their bill takes quite a while to grow. So even when they fledge, they are not quite able to pry open bivalves, which, as you might guess from their name, is what they eat. And so the parents will often subsidize them with food for 2 or 3 more months. And so they have this sort of post-fledging dependence on their parents. So it's kind of like college, if you want to map that onto humans. Some of the work that we do with these birds, just to kind of cover some of the activities that our staff are involved in, is we do monitoring, and one of the ways we know how we're doing with our management and what the birds might need is doing productivity monitoring, and that's tracking the success of particular species and particular pairs and nests to success or failure. We can't monitor every single nest because there's literally thousands of them, but we have certain species like oyster catchers that we pay extra attention to because they're a pretty good barometer of how things are going on the islands. The other thing we do with the oyster catchers is we give as many of them as possible these unique field readable color bands. And this is part of a range-wide banding effort to study their populations. And banding at its most fundamental level tells you how old they are and where do they go. But from that information, you can get a lot of demographic data, and you can understand survival and what might be driving population gains or losses. And pretty much every state in the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coasts bans their oyster catchers. So we're part of a larger effort to understand their populations. And they are actually one of those rare conservation success stories where their populations 15 or more years ago were in decline. And thanks to a lot of extra effort and management, they are now on a slight they're on an uptick. So we're hoping to get to 30% increase over about 20 years, which for a long-lived bird with relatively low reproductive output is quite an accomplishment. So we also will work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to try to get dredge material placed on our islands in a beneficial way. The 2 dredge material islands that we have that actively receive material on the Cape Fear River need that material so that we can maintain that open sandy habitat that many of the birds like to nest. And this is what it looks like when they get sand on the left-hand side. You could see on the kind of the upper left corner of the island, you might kind of see a narrow black line. That is the dredge pipe coming up out of the river. And you could see that it's pumping out what they call a slurry, which is basically just a mix of water and sand. And they've created a berm or a dike around the area on the island where we want the sand to go. Notice we're protecting the little wetland there in the bottom corner. And that is how we get sand onto the islands. And after a while, unfortunately, a vegetation moves in. And if you don't do some vegetation management in between dredge material placements, you will lose your sandy habitat. So we do vegetation management as well as work with the Corps. And that's really for the benefit of royal and sandwich terns. They are almost entirely dependent in North Carolina on dredged material islands. And as you can see in the graph, there's a very small percentage of them nest on natural islands, and so it's quite important that we have these places for them. And the vegetation management is done with the Habitat Division of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and they have the resources. They've got the right tools that we need. So basically, they have a ATV and a John boat that can hold the ATV, and it's got a little tank on the back. We do apply some herbicides periodically. We limit that as much as possible. And the other things that we do is we'll do some burns. Unfortunately, the burning doesn't so much kill off the vegetation as expose the sandy soil to where we can apply herbicide, just because a lot of plants are pretty tolerant of fire. But it is important to keep these areas open. If the islands were to vegetate totally, a lot of the species that like the oyster catchers and the terns would be extirpated from the area. And the other thing is it's kind of basically a gull predation management tool, because gulls like to nest in vegetated areas, and they really like to eat other birds' eggs and chicks. And so we kind of want to keep the gulls in their place and the open sandy birds in their place. And that little bit of separation means we've got fewer problems with gull predation. We also are getting into the oyster reef construction business. Oysters in North Carolina as a whole have been historically low numbers. Some estimates put our population of oysters statewide at 10% of what it used to be 100 or 150 years ago. And so one of the things that we have done is we have constructed an oyster reef. We have permits to build 3 additional ones. And so we selected these 3 sites here on the river in order to assess for suitability for oyster reefs. We found South Pelican Island, which is the northernmost green dot, was not very suitable for oyster reefs. So the 3 green dots to the south are where we have permits to build reefs. And like I said, we've got our very first one built last year, so we're pretty excited about that and hope to continue that. We are also do some work with following up on the food chain in the Cape Fear River. There is a lot of pollution that comes down the river, as some of you are probably aware. And with UNCW, we have a partnership to monitor monitor sediments, shellfish, and the water column for arsenic, mercury, and selenium. We also collect hatched eggshells from oyster catchers and feathers from oyster catcher chicks, and you can look and see if those biological materials contain these contaminants as well. So we're looking forward to the results of this student project. It's been going on since Hurricane Florence, and that was quite one of our first sampling trips was shortly after Florence. And so we are going to get to compare what it was like after a major hurricane and what it was like in years with less severe weather events. We've also been collecting some samples, opportunistically finding deceased chicks, and collaborating with a student who's getting her PhD at the University of Rhode Island in order to assess levels of emerging contaminants, mainly PFAS, so Gen X type compounds in birds. We've collected royal terns, sandwich terns, oyster catchers, and brown pelican chicks. And preliminary results are that we do have among the highest levels of emerging contaminants in our Cape Fear River birds. What that means for their health is a whole other question, but we have documented their presence in the birds. We don't actually see we're not seeing any die-offs or anything very obvious, but there are questions about how this can affect growth and development, immune system function, things like that. And hopefully we'll be able to investigate further with new partners down the road. So thank you very much to the photographers. And I would be quite happy to entertain any questions that have come in over the time, and I'll stop sharing my screen if possible.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for that super amazing webinar. It was so informative, and I loved all the pictures and all the information you had to share. We did have one question from Bill Willis. Are the use of drones allowed in your documentation efforts, and would they cause disturbances to nesting birds?
To answer the second question first, yes. It depends on the drone and a lot of different conditions, but yes, drones can be very disturbing to birds because they can map as a aerial predator. They're falcons, bald eagles, those types of birds are predators on these species, and so if they see something up in the air, it can cause them to flush up and abandon their eggs or their chicks. We do sometimes, though, use drones to answer scientific questions and to count them, but these are under controlled conditions where we're able to make sure that we do not disturb our targets. So it's a balancing act, and it's a learning process. We were able to use drone flight to get a heat map of the surface temperature of our least tern colony on Lehutaf Island, and it took about 3 or 4 different iterations of the flight pattern, of the color of the drone, of the height at which the drone could fly, before we were able to actually collect data, because we were not able to disturb the bird. We didn't want to disturb the birds while we were collecting data on them. So yeah, it's a really, the things you can do with drones. There's great technology out there. The Wildlife Resources Commission has done some drone work to count white ibis in inland nesting. Not white ibis, I apologize. Wood storks in inland nesting colonies. So yeah, they can be a really great tool for collecting data, but it has to be done really carefully. Because of concerns about disturbance. And I should say that it is not actually legal to launch your drone from state-owned lands without permission. So, you know, if there's a lot of FAA and other types of regulations involved in just being an operator. And, you know, probably, you know, the average person who buys a consumer type drone just to, you know, have fun with, play with, take some cool video, might not really get into that. They're probably playing with it in their neighborhood. But there's also those types of things to be aware of.
Awesome. That's really good to know. I see Brenda has a question. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can do that.
Hi, I just put it in the chat box. I was wondering about Battery Island. I know I heard a year or two ago that the ibis colony had abandoned the island in huge numbers, and I wondered what the status of the colony is there.
Yeah, so the ibis have come and gone from Battery Island over the years, and they're on seems to be a little bit of a cyclical thing. Back in 2000, I think it was 9, 10, and 11, they had abandoned, and we suspect that was due to a great horned owl, and that could be very distressing, even though the great horned owl might not kill you. It is basically a serial killer to an ibis, so they didn't want to be anywhere near it. And they all picked up and went to some other islands on the river. And then in 2018, the colony abandoned Battery Island again. No, I apologize, 2019. There was a problem with, we don't know for sure, but some bald eagles started hanging out on the island late in the previous season, and they started eating a bunch of the kind of recently fledged or just pre-fledged white ibis chicks. So again, there were still a lot of white ibis around, but you know, if there's a serial killer eating your neighbor's children, you probably decide you don't want to try to raise children there the next year. So the ibis abandoned, and they came back. And now we have a smaller colony and on Battery Island, and another colony that is somewhere in the freshwater wetlands on the western side of the Cape Fear River. So they do come and go. It does fluctuate, and that's probably in response to really, very scary predators to the ibis.
Awesome. Thanks for elaborating on that. Elizabeth is asking, is there a way to manage people migrating over to Masonboro Island across from Freeman Park starting to camp?
So Masonboro Island is managed by the North Carolina Coastal Reserve System, and they do allow camping on the island. There are areas that are posted to protect the nesting birds near the landing areas. And so most of Masonboro Island is accessible only at high tide because people are coming from the intercoastal waterway side, and you can only get kind of across the shallow bays on the western side of the island at high tide. A lot of you probably, paddle or boat over there. The folks that are camping at the southern end of the island, can get there on any tide because there's the channel that's right next to the island, but camping is allowed. There's not a lot of nesting activity on the south end of Masonboro Island, and we work with the reserve. We train their bird monitor, we help them to post, and we band their adults and their chicks. They have about 10% of the state's nesting oyster catchers there. So if there is a problem spot that arises, or if you have concerns that you're noticing during the season, contacting them is a really great way to help with the management. Reserve staff are out on the island multiple days a week during the spring and summer season as well. But if you have observations in particular about a particular location or a particular incident, it would be really great to share that with the reserve staff.
Great, that's good to know. I didn't know like when the season is, but I've noticed a lot of people migrating over from Freeman Park and making it is cheaper, and they don't pay a fee for camping. So I've seen more and more people starting to camp out, and some people were like from Greensboro, and they were there for a week, and I'm like, oh, the trash, they're leaving.
Oh dear. Yeah. I'll let the manager know. They might be aware already, or they might not have kind of put two and two together. Sometimes you don't necessarily.
I'm directly across from the inlet, so I can kind of see, and then every now and then I can take my kayak and kayak over and walk around the back quarter and get pictures of some of the pelicans resting on the islands and stuff while they're dredging. But to notice that they're coming over there and camping more and more is like, oh boy, this is becoming a habit. Yeah.
Well, and it's kind of a big difference, between having someone that's there for a few days and then someone that's there for a whole week, like you said, with the trash. So I'll mention that to them. They may have noticed it. There's one pair of oyster catchers that kind of has like a little spot that's tucked away near the south end that have been pretty successful. I've
seen ibis back in that little pond area where it's kind of a break with the inlet and the sand, and there's a little marsh area and stuff. So
those will be foraging. Yeah, they'll be the species that nest on Masonboro, you'll have Wilson's plovers, which I completely didn't show you any pictures of, and American oyster catchers primarily. Sometimes there's a least tern colony near the south end, but that'll be more, you got to walk around the tip of the inlet and up the ocean front. Right. But yeah, that's it's always a challenge with you want people to be able to enjoy the resource and use it, but you also don't want there to be, kind of these incompatible situations where there's damage to the landscape or to the wildlife. So definitely appreciate the thought. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, that's great resources to know and to point out. Let's see. Debbie is asking, have you partnered with local schools on any oyster bed restoration projects?
We haven't done any work with oysters and schools. Our sites where we have the oyster reef permits for are remote. You have to go in a boat to get there, and if we required, a barge and a crane to lift all the pallets of material off and place it. So, but the North Carolina Coastal Federation does a really great job with educating local students and having more accessible, mainland-based living shoreline type of projects that are more accessible to school children. We work with Wrightsville Beach School. They make art every year for some of our signs that we put up on Wrightsville Beach, where there's a nesting colony, and so that's been really great. We just don't really have any. It's difficult even to get like adult volunteers out there because of the location not being amenable. There's no carpooling.
Awesome, makes sense. Good to know. Dan is asking, could you speak a little bit more about nesting for standard gulls? And I don't know if, Dan, you wanted to elaborate more if you had any specific questions, but if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yes, Lindsay, first of all, thank you. Very informative. I was just curious, you didn't really talk about gulls, whether they nest on the islands on Cape Fear, or it seems like they're so prolific that they would be a competitor for all that prime real estate. Where do they nest? And I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, good question. So we do have a lot of gulls that nest on the Cape Fear River, and the main species that we have nesting on the river is the laughing gull, and that's the one that has kind of the dark gray back, the color of a chalkboard almost, and the black head. And so they are primarily a marsh nesting species, and so they are found in the greatest numbers nesting on the marsh islands in the rack and along the shell rakes. So when I say rack, I mean like that the dead Spartina straw that kind of washes up and forms big mats. They'll actually make their nests out of that, and the it'll be a nest made out of rack. And we do also have them on the dredged material islands, and that's kind of what I was getting at with the whole habitat management. Is the laughing gulls will also nest in we'll have like torpedo grass, or we'll have Spartina patens. They'll nest in that as well. And so if we kind of keep the vegetation down to more of a dull roar, we won't have as many of the gulls on the dredge islands. The gulls do compete and eat, so they compete for space and eat the royal terns and the sandwich terns and the oyster catcher's chicks. So we do kind of want them to be separate. So there are two other species of gull that nest on the Cape Fear River in very small numbers, and that's the herring gull and the great black-backed gull. Those are two species that are expanding their range southward, and fortunately we don't have large numbers of them because they are also quite aggressive and are not really a species that an oyster catcher, for example, wants to be neighbors with. So we have on the Cape Fear River, we have over 5,000 pairs of laughing gulls, but the vast majority of them will be on those natural islands.
Thank you.
You bet. And I have to say, I do enjoy the gulls. They need to have their own space.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. That was a good question. Bill Willis has a few questions about tern colony nests, including do they usually get mating pairs? Do they mate for life? Do they have partners? So I don't know if Bill, you wanted to elaborate more on your questions, or just kind of generally go over those mating characteristics of terns.
Some of these colonies that you showed are very dense, and I was wondering how you were able to, in a short period of time, get an accurate count of pairs. And are there also other yearlings or bachelors or spinsters involved in these colonies, and what's their role?
Those are great questions. So the way that we get an accurate count of pairs is we use a proxy, and that proxy is the number of nests. And so with the terns, in other states, some folks have been able actually to use drones to count royal tern colonies. We haven't really cracked that nut because it's really hard to tell the difference between royal terns and sandwich terns from above. So in that case, you would just be able to count the number of birds that you see kind of in an incubating posture in your aerial drone photography. But the way we do it, and the way it's been done in these colonial waterbird censuses for about 40 years, is we get a group of volunteers and we kind of mark off sections of the colony, because so you know which nests to count in your section, and you get one of those clicker counters like you see at concerts when people just need to rapidly count things, and we just count the nests. So you walk into the colony, they all get up, it's very loud, and it takes you about the sections that we mark off take about between 5 to 10 minutes to count, and then we move to the next area. And so the birds that were in the disturbed area sit back down and we go to the next area. And so in that way, we're able to move through there pretty quickly, and we're counting the nests on the ground. So basically, we go in when it's kind of peak of incubation. So if they initiate, it takes about 3 weeks, say, for a nest for the eggs to hatch. You count about 3 weeks out from when they start to initiate clutches, and that's probably when you have your peak number of birds, with a nest. Once they have chicks, it's very, very difficult would be very difficult to count. There are almost certainly birds that are not part of a pair at the colony. Those would be birds that are 2 or maybe 3 years old. Most terns start to breed at about 3 years of age, but you will see, especially at least tern colonies, you'll see these sort of, the male will do a fish flight. He flies around with a little minnow and he, presents it to females and tries to get one to accept him as a mate. And you'll see in kind of late summer, you'll see these hapless males flying around with a fish, and you can probably bet those are second year, maybe third year birds that just haven't quite gotten the hang of it yet, and they're practicing, they're working on it. They do not have any they do not help to feed other chicks. They aren't they're not cooperative in that way. But it is funny, especially least terns, you'll see that quite a bit, the practice fish flights and practice presentations.
Well, thank you very much. That's very good information.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, that is so interesting. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to do the little raise hand icon. But we're wrapping up here. Okay, let's see. April, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. Very, very exciting. I'm definitely very interested in pelicans, so that was wonderful information about them. I know you mentioned the, volunteer opportunities are hard to come by because of the logistics of getting out there. Just wondering, I do have, we have a local Girl Scout troop of all 5th graders. I didn't know if there was anything on the land that we could do to help with preparation. We're always looking for the opportunity for service projects, if there's anything we could do to help.
Oh, that's adorable. We do, and we have volunteer events. So we, getting to some of these specific places like our oyster reef sites is quite challenging. And then we also have the added challenge of the pandemic. But we do sometimes have things that are suitable, and we definitely will have more things when the pandemic is over, at whatever point that turns out to be. As we enter year 2 of it. So the best way to kind of figure out if we've got anything compatible is just to drop me an email. And my email address is laddison, ADDISON, at Audubon, AUDUBON.org. And, a lot of the things that we do, that we use for volunteers is kind of group based, and so a little bit of a challenge for the pandemic times. But we also we do have a I mentioned the Wrightsville Beach School, and they kind of do a little learning project where they learn about beach nesting birds, and then they make signs to tell people about beach nesting birds. And we actually we get funding to print the signs from the Harbor Island Garden Club, which is very generous of them. And so the kids' artwork actually ends up on these educational signs. So it's kind of like a whole, you know, unit of study that they do. And so I know that other Audubons around the coast in other states have done those kinds of projects with the troop, and then they can actually go out and install their signs, you know, at a nesting site, which is pretty exciting for the kids.
That's great. Thanks for the information. I appreciate the email and the chat as well. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks. That's great. Someone put that. I don't know if I actually am allowed in the chat because I don't think I have a Teams account. So thanks for putting my email in there.
No problem.
Yeah, just shoot me an email and hopefully we can figure something out.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. Great questions. Are there any other final questions for Lindsay? All right, I think we're wrapping up here, but thank you so much to everybody for participating today. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for taking the time out of your day to do this amazing presentation. It was absolutely fantastic. And Virginia, did you have any other closing remarks or anything?
No, just thank you to Lindsay. We have a couple of upcoming events on February 18th, Thursday at noon. We have a presentation on agricultural entrepreneurship by the Youth Ambassadors for a Better Community. This will be a presentation by some really great young people based out of Delco, North Carolina, and they have a vacation victuals program where they bring in fresh produce to vacationers in the beach communities, so you get to learn more about them. And we also have 2 cleanups coming up soon. The first is 9 a.m. this weekend, this Saturday, February 13th at Burnt Mill Creek in downtown Wilmington with our friends at Cape Fear River Watch, and another one at 9 a.m. on Saturday, February 27th at Carolina Beach State Park with the Friends of Pleasure Island State Park and Nature Connect North Carolina. And you can learn more about that on our Facebook page or by emailing us or going to North Carolina Wildlife Federation's brand new fabulous website at www.ncwf.org. And they have all the details on our and all the chapters' upcoming cleanups and presentations on there.
Fantastic.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.